If it's something brand new and you can't relate it, you have to create a new entry. So you have to grapple with it. You have to say, what does that mean? But as I broke it down, I bet you could associate it with something you already understood. You've probably all seen little embryos. You got the idea of an egg, the idea that it kind of recaptures our development from a primitive one cell to a very complex mammal. You get that idea. That's the meaning of meaningfulness. Now, as a teacher, I think all of us, or as we are teachers, we all try to make things meaningful in our classes. So we give stories, we give examples, but sometimes our examples don't work for you. This is where you have to tease it out. So I'm going to go to a couple things to help you there. First, study groups. We underutilize them, especially community college. Would people get through med school without study groups? Not very many. Do we have vet tech back there? Dental hygiene, vet tech. Pretty sophisticated stuff they have to learn, right? Do they do study groups? No? Oh my. I would hope they do. I would encourage them to do it. Where I've got students to form study groups, performance of the groups go up dramatically. Now, part of it is probably because they're motivated to do that, so it's a bit confounded. But I'm convinced there's also the power of studying with other people. I know these concepts in psych so well, I can't see how they're confusing. But another student who's just found the answer can sometimes turn and say, Thursday, here's what it's about. And you go, is that what Mr. Lobdell was saying? God, it's so easy. But I can't do that because I don't see where the problems lie in that particular concept. Study groups are great, okay? I'm now going to tell you how many of you totally hurt yourself in studying. How many of you magic mark, highlight, whatever you call it, your textbooks? The little yellow, pink, green, glow-in-the-dark sort of things. How many of you use the markers? Those were invented in '65, year I started college. So I bought one. I turned entire books ugly orange. And then I figured it out. If you color every page solid orange, you've actually highlighted nothing. Yeah, by highlighting everything, you've really highlighted zip. So I did the clever thing, and you guys are way ahead of me. What do you highlight, folks? The most important thing. When do you do it? When you first read the book, right? Or the chapter. So you read through, are you studying? No, I'm reading for the most important things. Zip, zip, zip. And some of you get out rulers to make it really neat. Take hours to make pretty little. Then you go back to the start of the chapter. You read the first thing you underlined and you go, I remember that. No, you don't. You recognize it. People are incredible at confusing recognition with recollection. Your visual recognition threshold is so great, you can see a person once, see them years later and go, I know you. Were you a student at Pierce College? Yeah. Did you take psych? Yeah. From Lobdell? Yeah. Yeah. 36 years I run into that, okay? Proof of this, grab a magazine in your house that you haven't looked at for a while, leaf through it, you will get the illusion of remembering virtually every advertisement and article. But to prove that it's not recollection, it's actually recognition, before you turn to the next page, predict what's on it. There's no way you're going to be right. But as soon as you turn, you go, oh, I remember that. No, you don't. You recognize it. Now, going back to your book, you've highlighted the most important stuff. You now go back to study it and you say, oh, I remember it. So do you study it? No. So what don't you learn? The most important part of the chapter. And then they come in the next day all ready for the quiz. Oh, I studied hard last night, Mr. Lobdell. Here's your quiz. I don't believe it. I can't remember a thing. How many of you heard that? Those of you who teach, I could retire now if I had $1 for every one of those comments. I don't correct him. I shake my head and think, poor baby, you think you knew it, but in fact, you recognized it. You didn't know it. Now back to this active learning. How do you know it? If you can look at it, go to the next one, read it, and then stop and go back to the one before. Look up in the sky and in your own words, say what that was about. Yeah, you know it. You will not forget it overnight unless you suffer a pretty major cerebral accident. It just doesn't happen. But while we're talking about this, most of you undo good studying by not sleeping adequately. Some of the latest work on REMing, we're not sure exactly how, but there's something going on. It involves the hippocampus. It involves the storage from a transitory long-term memory to a permanent, what we call consolidation. That just labels it, doesn't really say what's happening. But we're getting increasing evidence that that consolidation process is dependent on rapid eye movement sleep, which if you're an adult happens about every hour and a half once you fall asleep. If you're not getting a good night, typically around 8 hours, you're not getting enough REM. What you've studied doesn't become permanent. And I can tell you there are studies that show simply by getting better rest, some students improve markedly in their performance because their brain now stores it a lot more efficiently. By the way, if you know anybody with sleep apnea, biggest thing they'll tell you is, I can't remember anything. My brain's shot. It's like my memory's gone. Yeah, it is, because your REMing isn't happening, because you wake up so often, and you can't consolidate and store permanent memories. Here's the funny thing. There's no money to be made by telling people to get more sleep. So you don't hear about it on TV. Sylvian isn't telling you to get better sleep because they don't make any money. I tell students, and they go, yeah, that's nice, but they continue to use their time for other things. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? The best advice, sleep better, and most of you will do better. Most of you won't even begin to take it. And I know why. You got so many other things to do. I'd ask you this, are they important? Is studying and learning the most important thing you're doing as a student? If so, maybe you need to give up some of the other activities. I have students tell me, I don't have enough time. There's 162 hours in a week? We all have the same amount of time. Marty has no more nor less than anybody in this room. The real question is, what do I do with my 162 hours? Am I going to use it well or use it not so well? Okay? I'm going to give you a couple other tips here. Taking notes, so vital. But most students who do it haven't learned a very simple rule. The first moment you get after a class, ideally right after the class, you should sit down with your notes and expand on everything you jotted down. Give it depth, flesh it out, okay? If you even wait to go home and do it a couple hours later, you will have forgotten some of your own notes. How many of you have done that? You've written beautiful notes, you get them home, you don't know what the hell you wrote. It's like, what is this? Okay? Well, that's a wasted note. But if you take the moment right after class to flesh it out, you now have a little more detail. Odds are at night, you can still recollect it. That will be a powerful addition with only about a 5-minute time investment per class. That is a good trade-off. Okay? Now, the next piece. Let's say you're trying to flesh out your notes. It's like, I remember they said it or he said it, but I don't know what it was about. Look for a classmate. They're usually hanging around. Go up to somebody and say, hey, what was that about? And they can tell you. Or flatter the heck out of us. Teachers want students to succeed. Sometimes it isn't perceived that way. We want you to do well. It makes us happy. And anytime a student comes up in the lunchroom, where I always try to have my lunch, and says, Marty, I didn't quite understand this. Can you give me another example? I love it. I'm important. It's like, yeah, okay. You come to my office, not just with, I'm not getting anything, but what was that about when you were talking about REM sleep, you know? And I started explaining, that's what my life's about here, okay? We love it. That's a legitimate thing. Or if you don't want to go to the instructor's office, most of us start up a class. Any questions? Yeah, yesterday I didn't quite understand this piece about ontogeny recapitulating phylogeny. Okay, we'll go through that quickly. Once again, we like that. We want you to be successful. Okay, let me jump back here to see where I am in my presentation. Okay, I was talking about being active. Activity can also take the form of recitation. How many of you know the best way to learn is to teach somebody else? Boy, if you've got family members or roommates, teach them geography, psychology, anatomy. They often love it. One of my dearest students 2 years ago, God, I just loved her. I finally met her parents. Says, I've heard so much about you. I hear every lecture you've given. She would come home, sit around the dinner table, and recapitulate what I'd talked about. It's powerful because it reinforces your learning, plus it tells you if you really understood it. Because if mom or dad says, well, I don't quite get that, and you go, I don't understand it either, then very quickly you have to go back and redo it. Teaching another person. Now, some of you may not have anybody at home to teach, or they are not interested. Too bad. Teach an empty chair. There's nothing wrong with talking out loud. Thinking is internal talking to a large degree. There's also non-talking thinking. Talking out loud, as long as you know you're doing it, is not abnormal. If you think it's somebody else, or it's a real person in an empty chair, talk with me. I'll try to get you lined up with someone who can help. If you have roommates or friends, say, I'm just doing this little Socratic thing where I'm going to explain it to an empty chair. Dialogue with that empty chair. Practice it. Now, for some of you, writing it out in your own words is a good thing. I'm lazy. I never like to do a lot of writing. But I learned very quickly to look at it, look away, and do a little dialogue with myself. Because it told me if I really understood it or not, very quickly. I would also do it with my kids, teach them as best I could, my spouse, anybody who would listen. It's a nice way of learning. Active recitation. By the way, one piece of research said 80% of your study time is best spent reciting and only 20% reading. Okay? This leads to, how are we doing? I wanted to talk about textbooks. I brought the one I'm using in intro right now. Most students have not been taught how to use a textbook, and yet it's such a powerful tool. Because they haven't been taught the power of the tool, a large percentage don't even buy the book, in part because they're getting so darn expensive. Over $100 for this little puppy here, I believe. These books are designed for what's called pedagogy. That's a fancy way of saying helping you learn. And they are seriously done to be, at least according to the people doing it, the most effective way of teaching. But students don't know the effective way of using it. How many of you know of SQ3R? None? 1, 2. I assumed all of my students were still learning this until a few years ago I asked. It died out. There's also a SQ4R. There's a newer version of it, which I'm not so familiar with. SQ3R, survey, that's the S. Question, that's the Q. Then you have 3 R's, read, recite, review. And we were taught this because they knew pedagogically, way back in those dark ages of the 60s, that you retain much more from a text if you survey, question, read, recite, and review. So, how do you do the survey? These are not novels. In a novel, you wouldn't want to read the last page, would you? Find out who done it, it'd ruin the whole thing. But this is a textbook. So what you do is you actually go through the entire chapter. You look at pictures. Okay? What's this about apples? What's this about a duck-bill platypus? Okay. And what you're doing is you survey, you ask questions. What are formal concepts? What's a superordinate concept? What are natural concepts? Prototypes. What is a prototype? So you raise questions as you go through. It only takes a couple of minutes to survey a chapter in any class. Okay? As you're surveying, you simultaneously raise questions. What you're doing then is causing you to be looking for answers. And this is a powerful thing. How many of you have noticed When you're looking through a newspaper for a piece of information, you can find it, it kind of jumps out at you. But if you're just kind of reading it haphazardly, kind of casually, most of what you read you don't even remember. There's something about it, and I can't explain it, I can only describe it. If you intend to find something, you find it. And I've got a little demonstration I could have brought where I actually show a placard with the words Boston and London printed on them. And I hold it up for 20 seconds. Out of a group this size, maybe 2 or 3 of you'd see Boston and London. Because before I do it, I tell you to look for letters, symbols, and numbers. I create what's called a set. You're now expecting not to see words, but letters. And even though Boston and London are printed on diagonal, most people don't see it. Likewise, if you just kind of go through a book without asking questions first, you kind of skizz over the content. You don't have the search mechanism going, okay? The reading followed by the recitation, I've talked about that. Technically, before a test, it should be review. It should be in the barn. Now you're just touching up to make sure you haven't lost anything or confused anything. But I know how this works. Because we schedule tests, most students don't start studying until shortly before an exam. And much like my friend, they put so much time all massed together and only study for about a half hour, pull all-nighters so they don't get the good rest, come in and do poorly. You're undoing yourself. If you start studying early and do some of the things I've talked about, by the time you get to the test, you're just reviewing at that point, not truly studying. Okay, use the book correctly, SQ3R. Okay, I got one last thing, and I'm gonna get it. You've got to memorize facts. How do you do that? And I love it because I get a lot of students from anatomy coming to me going, I can't remember.